Good afternoon and welcome to this CMALT week session on stepping up to senior CMALT. Delighted to have you join us today. It's been a fantastic CMALT week so far. We've had lots of really exciting events happening and a lot more to come for the rest of the week too. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and I'm delighted to welcome our three presenters, Julie, Pooin and Matt. So welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great for us to be here, and thank you very much for joining today's session on stepping up to senior CMALT. This session, just to make sure you're in the right space, is about if you want to move from having a CMALT of some sort or moving into a senior CMALT. If you haven't been familiar with the senior CMALT specification, we'll go through that a little bit. So if you've not got CMALT at all, yes, absolutely do stay. But we are also looking at a lot of the discussion points here about how we transition from a standard CMALT or even an associate CMALT into the senior CMALT position. So without further ado, I thought what we'll do first of all is just, if you haven't joined us on Zoom before, there's some basic functionality that we encourage you to use throughout. Please do use the chat pane. We'll be using some questions and ask you to respond in the chat throughout the session. If you wanted to contribute to any of our questions that we pose to you on the mic as well, you're very welcome to do so. You could just pop your hand up using the reactions little icon there, and hopefully all should be well. So thank you very much to Alt for hosting and arranging this as well. CMALT is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm sure Julie and Pooin can say the same thing as well. So first up, we just wanted to ask who is senior CMALT for, with a bit of introduction to us first, and then asking who you are, if you want to put your role in the chat, and whether you've got CMALT already and what level that is will be really useful for us to know. So if you want to add that to the chat, who you are, what's your role, and if you've got CMALT already. And I'll start by saying that I'm Matt Cornock, Head of Online Learning at the University of Leeds. I've been a CMALT holder since 2010, I think, probably, when I was originally working on distance learning programs as a learning technologist, and I moved into working at a central position, overseeing lecture capture across the University of York, and then moved to overseeing online professional development at a non-profit, and my current position now at the University of Leeds. So I've gone through CMALT and the senior CMALT pathways, and I'm an assessor. I think I've assessed countless portfolios, maybe some of you in the room even, and it's something I really enjoy, and I really see CMALT as a development opportunity, not just for candidates, but also for me as well. So I'll hand over to Pooin.
Hello everyone, so I'm Pooin. I am currently one of the heads of digital education at the University of Birmingham. I'm also a trustee of Alt, and I just bounce about in various online spaces. So I got my senior CMALT actually before I took on my first senior leadership role, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. As Matt was saying, I'm also very passionate about CMALT and senior CMALT. I think they are slightly underrated, but certainly a very good value for, when you're looking for the next opportunity to showcase your specialism and your leadership for senior CMALT, particularly in your practice. So yeah, I will hand over to Julie.
Hi there, thanks Pooin. I'm Julie Vose. I'm Head of Digital Education at City St George's University of London. I've had my CMALT since 2015, and then I did my renewal in 2018, and we are talking about renewals in the webinar on Friday. So if you are going to renew, then that's the place to come. But then it got to sort of 2022 and I thought, oh, do I want to renew again, or do I want to look at senior CMALT? So I then applied for senior CMALT as a full portfolio. And so, yeah, here I am ready to renew mine again in 2025.
Thanks very much. It's great to see that the range of roles as well that are in the chat. So a very warm welcome to everyone here who's joined today, whether you are a recent CMALT holder or someone who's been involved in learning technology and CMALT for a number of years. It's really good to have this range of participation here. So we'll try and sort of capture everyone's interests. Also really interested to see that we have a lot of people from a range of roles. It's not all about managers, which is crucial. This is the point we're trying to make through this session. In fact, that senior CMALT is not all about being a manager or a senior leader in your organization, and it applies to a whole range of different roles. So thanks very much for everyone for joining. I'm going to hand over to Julie now to cover the key differences between what you may be familiar with and senior CMALT.
Thanks, Matt. So for those of you who have got CMALT or are working towards it, obviously it's made up of 4 core areas plus specialist areas. But the main difference is for senior CMALT is that there are additional areas that you need to do, but also you need to make sure that throughout your portfolio, you're reflecting on the impact of your work, but also how you are providing leadership and influencing others. And as Matt said, you don't have to be a manager, you don't have to be in a leadership role per se, but you do need to show that you are able to lead people, whether that's through projects or initiatives in your institution or outside of your institution. But how do you influence others, maybe to adopt some of the technologies that you're supporting? But when it comes down to the actual portfolio, section 3 is slightly different. So for CMALT, you typically do 2 legislative areas or policy, whereas for senior CMALT, you have to do 1 area of policy. So you don't have the choice. It is 1 legislative at least and 1 policy area. And when we talk about policies, we're thinking about things like maybe strategies within your institution. It could be like a lecture recording or an assessment policy. It could be frameworks that you need to use, maybe a VLE checklist or minimum standards. It could be professional standards within particular disciplines. For example, our colleagues who work with nursing and midwifery might need to be aware of Nursing Midwifery Council guidelines. So there's a whole range of things you can include under policy. And again, you don't have to have written policy yourself. It's just about how you apply it in your work and how you work with others in a leadership role to make sure that they're applying it. Section 5, for standard CMALT, you would be writing 1 specialist area, but for senior CMALT, you're writing 2 specialist areas. So it's just thinking about 2 areas of specialism that you would have. And then the main part of senior CMALT is this advanced area. And this is where people get a little bit confused. It's not just an extra specialist area. It is slightly different, and actually it asks you within the guidelines to address the 4 core CMALT principles and thinking about the leadership and wider impact of your work. So there's a whole range of topics that people have included under advanced area, but here it really is about your leadership, and that's a really good topic to pick, is reflecting on your leadership throughout that portfolio. So we'll cover a little bit about the advanced area later, but Matt, if you can move on to the next slide. Some people, when they are writing at senior CMALT level, actually find it easier to do sections 3 and sections 4, core areas 1 and 3 and 4, and less easy to do 1 and 2, which when you're working at CMALT, you're often very hands-on, you're working directly with academics. When you're in more of a leadership senior role, it can be a bit more difficult to evidence these, but it's coming back to, you don't have to be hands-on for these sections. Although, you know, some of it is about your technical knowledge. Your technical knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you can code something particularly well or you're using the VLE on a regular basis. It's more about how do you in your role know how these technologies work? How do you pass that on to maybe the senior leaders that you're working with? Could be people like associate deans in the schools or faculties, could be you know, senior management. How do you tell them about the technologies that you're supporting and deploying? And it's taking that step back. What are you putting in place to deploy these technologies? Whereas in a CMALT, you might be more talking about training sessions you've run. In a senior CMALT, it might be more about how you're overseeing that program of training, how you're making sure that that's meeting the needs. So yeah, we talked about here, you know, advocacy, reporting, making those recommendations, but it's always coming back to that interplay between technology and teaching, technology and learning and assessment. So yeah, thinking about what groups, committees are you involved with? How do you influence them to get across what you're trying to achieve? Thinking about your target learners. Often people think about, well, I'm running a training course. My target learners are the staff who come on the course. But taking that step back and thinking at an institutional level, who are the learners that we're supporting? So in my own senior CMALT portfolio, I do some teaching. So I did that sort of very small scale. Here are my direct people that I teach, but actually more broadly, who are the learners in my institution? What's the demographic of them? At City St George's, we have a lot of commuter students. We have, a widening participation aspect. We have disabilities. So how do we factor in all of that into the services that we provide? So thinking about things like lecture capture, how is that supporting this wider group of students? So it's not people you have direct contact with necessarily, but that indirect target learner. So the other area is, if you are struggling to think about sections 1 or 2 from a more senior perspective, think about where those gaps might be and what could you do as part of your senior CMALT journey. We always say, I work with a cohort of CMALT people, and we always sort of say to them, it's not just about what you've done. Actually, this is helping you to think about your own practice and progress, so you can be doing things as part of your CMALT journey and then writing up about that. It doesn't have to be just things you've done previously. So that's sort of how to think about the different sections. So as I said, the focus is on that leadership aspect. So Matt, what is leadership?
What is leadership indeed? So we're not going to define it first of all. We thought it might be worth us all just doing this as a group. And again, looking at your different backgrounds, different perspectives, just take a couple of moments now to jot down in the chat, or if you wanted to say on camera or mic, what is your definition of leadership? This is where I miss the little icons that tell me that people are typing.
Of course, they're typing. They're thinking about their leadership definition as well.
Well, we have a leader here. So Kieran, thank you very much. Being a role model. So yes, one aspect of leadership.
A leader is the servant for the people they lead. Indeed.
Support and direction towards a common and defined goal. I'll talk more about that in a second. Thanks, Sam. Ross saying listening, understanding, driving and supporting change. Diva's mentioned driving change. Steering the ship strategically whilst empowering to do great work that you can then take the glory for as the leader. Absolutely. We're empowering others to take the glory.
Take the glory while giving people credits, of course.
Of course. Influence. Matt, what do you mean by normal or otherwise? That would be useful if you could expand that. Servant leadership or coaching. This language is servant. I've never heard that before. That's really interesting that's a word being used. Input with direction, taking responsibility, listening before acting. What's a bad leader? Not giving you space to grow or work stuff out. Oh, we got drawings happening. Interesting. Influence, supporting, inspiring others, kind of supportive, different leadership styles, but situational leadership. I think we'll be talking about that certainly. So this is really useful, different definitions here. And if we look at the CMALT guidance, definition of impact leadership is deliberately broad and inclusive. So the language that's used in the guidance is that it talks about significant impact, influence on learning and teaching within either a local or institutional context, as well as that influence on a national or international reach. And that's the way you really want to look for your advanced area. So the lateral language, all senior CMALT candidates will be able to articulate how, within their particular context, and that's really important to note, it's all about leadership in your situation. So that contextual statement at the beginning of your portfolio is key to helping assessors understand what leadership means in that context. how you demonstrate leadership and influence others, how you communicate, collaborate, and contribute to that wider community of practice at either local, national, and international level. So a lot of what we talked about actually in here seems to focus on sort of leadership within teams and within groups. So I think what we probably need to look at is how your leadership influences beyond your immediate team or beyond your immediate local area. That's the difference between CMALT and senior CMALT, really. Senior CMALT is about leading beyond your immediate area of influence and stretching yourself out to wider. Julie Poon, is that your vibe as well?
I think so, yeah. So CMOD is very much about what have I done, about my own sort of practice, and then seniorly CMOD is about how have I influenced others to achieve X, Y, and Z. So it's about, yeah, and about you as well, of course, you know, how have I influenced a project to change practice, etc. So it's a little bit about you as well, but it's more so about other people through your influence and direction and support, and you know, many examples people have already listed in the chat.
So crucially, this is not about line management. This is not about how you operationalize a team in a line management way. There are other definitions of leadership and management are very separate. Now, I have no way of trying to clear what's on here. So just see if I can rub that out. There we go. One of the useful tools for your portfolio when you think about leadership, you've got to be able to evidence responsibility, decision making, and how you make recommendations to others through your leadership. This is particularly important where you're influencing practice or influencing senior leaders or influencing policymakers or groups, or what groups and committees you sit in, what recommendations that you bring with your expertise as a learning technologist or working in the field of learning technologist. Field of learning technologist to influence that interplay between teaching, learning, assessment, and the use of technology. And so your leadership comes through your ability to evidence that responsibility and decision making. Now, one way of doing this is to actually look at some of the theoretical viewpoints on leadership. And I've got 3 examples here. You may have others which are more applicable to your own context, but these are the ones that both myself and Abby Shaw, who's also helped put this session together, we talked about this and the different spaces we've got to work in. So there's this third space of working, which we often find as professional service staff within educational contexts, is that we bridge both the academic and the administrative or service functions within an institution. And that means that our boundaries and roles could be quite ambiguous. And we have to find our own way through different structures, both formal and informal structures, mixing between different groups of people as well. And so our leadership is really, in those different spaces, can be very difficult to define. And so we have to take a step back and think, well, what am I doing in these spaces? How can I influence these different areas by having an understanding of how those different areas operate? So this is what White and colleagues talked about in their paper about having that flexibility and that unspoken authority. You're coming in there as an expert. You're coming in there with evidence and practice to navigate between those boundaries. The second example here is about that bridging role. And I talked about this at the ALT conference a couple of years ago. In my role at the moment, I have to bridge both the leadership of my team, what my team needs and how I develop my team to deliver on our objectives, and what's coming at the university level from the strategic point of view. And so my role as a leader is a bridge between the operational and the strategic. And that can really be quite useful to identify where your place is in that mix. So that bridging role can be really useful if you are in that position of having to bridge strategy and operations, but also if you're operating at a departmental level, maybe not engaging with the university strategy or institutional strategy, there are still ways that you can bridge different educational spaces, different disciplines, different contexts that are brought in by those disciplines. How one subject uses learning technology will be very different from another subject, and how you can lead practice in those different areas in that role to bridge experience, bridge expertise across those different spaces. And the final example here is often talked about, and Abby mentioned it as well, was about distributed leadership. So this is, and touching upon what was put in the meeting chat as well, this is not about you doing all the work or you being this sole person to drive things forward. It's about empowering others and enabling others to succeed, but also empowering yourself. So if you're not in a formal leadership position, how have you been able to demonstrate your influence by putting yourself in a position where you can influence and generate impact? So you can use these different theoretical viewpoints to help reflect on how you've demonstrated that type of leadership approach. And it just makes leadership a little bit more tangible than and gives it a definition that's appropriate to your context, which could be really useful in terms of reflection on portfolio. Julian P, is there anything else you wanted to add on to that? Or any questions from anyone on that?
I think one thing to add is when you are reflecting on your leadership, think about any leadership training you've been on, any courses, have you got a set of leadership values, or is there a particular way? So, people talked about like situational leadership. What type of leader are you? So throughout the portfolio, thinking about how your leadership style influences how you approach things as well, and definitely bring in certificates of training courses you've been on, and any feedback you've had around your leadership.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, the other keyword that you'll see in the CMALT portfolio is impact. So I'm going to hand over to Puyin now, and I think we're going to ask the question: what is impact?
Exactly. We'll give you some examples and some of our thoughts, but before that, of course, we want to hear what your thoughts are on what is impact. And that sometimes might overlap with sort of, you're reflecting on what your leadership style, because reflecting on your leadership approach leads to how you measure your impact. So they very much go hand in hand. Please feel free to come to the mic if you wish to. Evidence of change, impact involves measurable change. So sometimes I think impact, it needs to be qualitative and quantitative. It needs to be a bit of both. And I suppose measurable change would be more quantitative. Make a hopefully positive and lasting difference to the people or the institution. Indeed. What have you done has stuck or imprinted on someone or something that can be measured and replicated by others. Impact can be leading change or leading and articulating resistance to change, which doesn't necessarily bring positive outcomes. I think for those of you who went to DigiFest this year, I think that the theme throughout the 2 days were failures is okay, as long as you've learned through failing on doing something, what's the outcome, what have you learned, and how you're gonna, take that lessons forward. I think those are legitimate impact as well.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Both positive and not so positive impact in terms of whether you've met your goals, but there's a much longer term impact from the learning, isn't there?
Not everything is sort of like a straight line, isn't it? Sometimes you take a bit of a scenic route and you still get there eventually with probably a better outcome through the lessons learned. So yeah. So shall we move on then, or do people want a couple? I'll give you a couple more minutes. We'll probably have a bit of time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, some people are talking about that impact on others, but also it's what was the impact on yourself? How have you changed as a result of doing this work? It comes back to that sort of reflective aspect, but what was the impact on you, not just on others as well? And when we think about impact, like you said, we are talking about, quantitative impact, and people who have got the sort of stronger CMALT portfolios will have included some of this as part of that, but it's just more obvious. It needs to be more obvious in the senior CMALT. So thinking about what data you can bring in, and what quotes and examples you can bring to show some of that impact.
The evidence is really key here, isn't it? It backs up the assumptions sometimes, and when we're marking portfolios as well, we would want to see evidence for any assertion you've made that something has happened. So if you say something along the lines of, and student performance was better, well, where's your evidence for that? How do you know that? Or if you can say that confidence in your staff has increased, well, how do you know that? And finding some way to bring that evidence of impact is really important. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is there's quite a dated model from Guskey. It's 2001, and this is used in teacher professional development to look at the impact that teachers can make on their students, on their colleagues, and on their institution. And thinking from those three different lenses can be quite useful sometimes too.
I wonder if now is the point to mention, because it's a question of what if I change jobs? How do I go back to my old job and get evidence? Always comes up in sort of webinars like this, and I know all too well what it's like to be changing jobs. And I think my advice on that is collect your evidence of impact as you go along. If you got a nice email from someone saying, thank you very much, the course you've designed has changed my practice X, Y, and Z, take a screenshot of that. Any data you can gather, obviously without breaching GDPR, any kind of backend, I don't know, Moodle, attendance data, etc. Take a screenshot. You might not need them, but your future self will thank you for collecting them now. Because it is very hard to look back in the last 3 to 5 years to then collect impact in one go. So I have I'm not ashamed to say I have an I'm amazing folder in one of my Google Drives, and it has loads of random stuff in there that has been really useful. And I think Julie has a similar folder somewhere as well, don't you? We talked about it on many occasions. So yeah, that would be my advice. Collect your evidence as you go along. Right, so we're going to move on to oh, sorry, Matt. I was moving along on my offline copy there. So reflecting impact and leadership. So remember, we're looking for evidence, as Matt and Julie have said, that you think analytically about effectiveness and impact, and how your work and of others have evolved as a result. So qualitative and quantitative evidence are both welcome. And when you're reflecting on that, as we mentioned earlier, failure is okay as well. So I think oftentimes when we're submitting portfolio of this nature, we want to show the shiniest examples. That's great, but you can legitimately, I think I've included 1 or 2 failed projects in my senior CMALT because the impact was we have affected changes. The project we initially set out to do doesn't actually work, so we have decided to move on to other things. That's okay as well. So you need to kind of think about what wouldn't have happened if I wasn't in the room. So think about, okay, this project has failed, but if I was there to lead, would I have led to a more positive result, or the other way around? And think about how you have personally, it's about you, not about other people, influence decision and changes based on what you know and what you've learned along the way. And as a leader, again, it's not about manager, how you bring people together. So sometimes even the most junior person in a team can be a leader. Very often they are good leaders because they are more on the ground and they can bring people together to develop a common goal. So it's, and I think impact is something that, I mean, from my lived experience, I am not ashamed to say I failed dramatically in my first attempt at senior CMALT because I went for it too soon. Impact is something that you can't really measure overnight. It's something that is kind of longer lasting. So between my 2 attempts, I think there was a year gap, and the examples that I use were very much the same examples, but because a year had gone by, I was able to show bigger impact because the course I've designed have had more people successfully completing that. So that's something to bear in mind. Don't rush into it. I think is my advice. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, particularly when you're looking at leadership and impact together, unless you are on perpetual interim positions, and if you are on interim positions, you do have to show an impact much sooner anyway. That's the whole point of having interim post. But if you're not in an interim position, you have got I'd say the luxury of being able to build up that story over a number of years, and that can show quite an in-depth level of responsiveness to what's happening. So how you're measuring your objectives, how you're responding to those, what changes you then make, how you involve others, and then seeing that impact ultimately on the students over a number of years I mean, that's a really good detailed picture that you could put in an advanced section, for example. But on sort of some of the other sections, you still need to be thinking about the impacts of leadership throughout the whole portfolio. And so they might be smaller examples. So you can probably need to think of a mix of short, small and big examples to put throughout the whole CMALT portfolio.
And I think something just reflecting on my own, senior CMALT, I included one example that's the same for my CMALT and my senior CMALT. So for that particular example, it was building a kind of like a system behind the scene. I actually went back to my colleagues 3 years later to say, can you give me an update of the latest figures of how many people have used the system for what it's intended for? And they were like, okay, well, in the last couple of years, there has been however many thousand people have used it. And I kind of thought, okay, great. There has been obviously development in the last 2 or 3 years time. But the point is, I still planted the seed. I still did the initial kind of design and architecture. So I still claim some credits of it. And obviously, when you are kind of claiming credits of project you've done a few years ago and people might have improved that, obviously state that clearly in the portfolio to say, okay, I initially done that and I've handed it over to someone else, but you can still claim the impact because you have still been a part of that project, that journey. So don't get too caught up in sort of, what have I done in the last year or two? You can go back as long as you can prove what you've done is still relevant. I think Julie mentioned that in the chat. You need to demonstrate the things that are still relevant to your practice or still has impact on other people. So don't get too caught up on, how long ago it has been. It doesn't really matter too much. All right then. Does anyone have any question or any comments before we move on? We can always come back to any question later on. So we're going to move on to us reflecting on our impact and leadership. So Julie goes first.
Yep, so this was a bit of text that I've taken from my senior CMALT. So I, in core area 4, which is around sort of communication, collaboration, dissemination, I talked about how we reshaped some of our team meetings, so how the team communicates and works together. And this was part of my reflection. So I was reflecting on my leadership style, thinking about that sort of collaborative style. And so the example was about getting that feedback from the team, but also thinking about where the impact was there. The impact was that the team felt more connected. The sort of evidence I provided was a quote from a member of my team about the changes that we'd made to the structured team meetings, some evidence around the team meeting principles that we have. So yeah, this was a very simple example, but it is that reflection on leadership and showing that impact. So yeah, just a snippet from my portfolio. So I'll hand over to Matt next.
And my example is one from quite a few years ago now, when I wasn't in a formal leadership management type of role. I was in that bridging role that I talked about earlier, trying to connect different groups of people from across an institution. On this case, it was about lecture capture. And what I've done here is, because this very much tied with my own postgrad studies on education and leadership, so I was able to pull that into my portfolio that way. That helped with the theoretical framework that I used as the basis. So I knew I wanted to look at confidence, I wanted to look at change in practice, but I also wanted something a little bit say woollier. I would say a bit more ill-defined, I suppose, knowing that sometimes these activities, these development activities with colleagues may not have any concrete outcomes at that point in time, because it might take another 6 months for them to then teach their module again. But there may be some evidence of change of thinking. And that was the bit that I wanted to touch upon through this example, where in the development workshop that I ran, and there was a lot of that went around that. I wasn't just running a workshop, there was a whole suite of evidence that I had to collect, and bringing different stakeholders and different viewpoints in to make this work, and some follow-up afterwards as well. But in the workshop, the shifting of thinking was evidenced through the comments that were captured in a poster. And so the poster became part of my evidence for my CMALT, because it showed the before, essentially the before and after of the way that colleagues were thinking. That's the impact of my leadership in their development as a result of that intervention. So the key thing you'll see here, though, is evidence coming in to back up each of those statements. My portfolio is still on the website. The wording, I think, could have been improved, so I have slightly tweaked the wording for the purpose of this slide. But that's always the way when you go back to something a few years later.
But that's core improvement, isn't it? You know, I went to when I one of the best lessons I learned from my undergrad degree first year was our tutor telling us, when you finish, you should be proud of what you've achieved. But 5 years down the line, if you look back and you're still proud of what you've done on your BA, then you have a problem. So that was a lesson of reality. You know, we're always improving. We look back and we look at what we've achieved. Yes, they were great once upon a time, but you should be critical of what you have achieved a few years ago, because that's show your thinking, your analytical mind has improved. The way he phrased it was really weird, but that was also a life lesson to learn. So reflecting on my impact and leadership, as I said earlier, when I gained my senior CMA, I was in a kind of sort of senior learning technologies kind of role, wasn't really leading very much in my day job. So I decided to go with my impact in the sector. So I included things like how I've led communities of practice, one of which was actually with Epishore that we started during the pandemic. And I've also led various communities of practice, and also conference presentation, presenting my research and my interaction with peers, what they've learned, etc. So to be quite honest with you, in my senior CMO portfolio, there were very little about kind of day-to-day work related examples. It was mostly about my impact in the sector. And that was challenging to prove impact, because I can't always see what have I done has done anything to anyone. So I was quite aggressively collecting testimonials from colleagues. I was shameless messaging people to say, can you tell me what, if anything, I've done has influenced you in any way at all? And I have to say, Sam, I know you're here today. You are fast becoming my #1 fan, because almost 2 years later, she has resurfaced my blog post about how I've transitioned from CMALT to senior CMALT within 2 years. Something I wrote and I forgot about. So things like that are great impact, because it shows something you've done once upon a time is still having an impact on other people. So yeah, I think that's me. Kind of informal leadership in probably the most informal way you can possibly imagine, but it works. So
Thanks, Pierre. So we're going to pick up now on the advanced area for the senior CMALT. So it's the only level of CMALT that has this section, the advanced area. And what again is key here is looking very closely at the guidelines. Do engage with the guidelines for this area. It is not another specialist area. It is something that you should be able to demonstrate over a period of time, rather than an individual project. It should be something that you can demonstrate your growth, essentially. That they make the best advanced areas on the senior CMALT portfolios. So this is about learning technology as well. It may be an obvious point to state, but this is a learning technology focus. It's different from, for example, Advanced HE Fellowship, which is broader. This is specifically about learning technologies within your context, whether that's a department, an institution, or wider sector. So make sure that your advanced area has got that angle to it. We have some really good advanced areas on leadership, on service management, on research, on teaching. But they all have this common element of learning technology. And one of the reasons why that's important is if you look at the specification, you have to put in there the 4 core areas from the CMALT principles. So that gives you that guidance. So there's some examples there. And I think just as a reminder also, when you're reflecting against any part of your portfolio, again, look at the guidance. There are questions in there. What have you learned? What went well? What went differently? And when we're looking at impact, there's a question we put on earlier in the slides, which is what would happen if I wasn't in the room? That gives you a really good idea of the level of impact, the level of influence you've had to support that reflection as well. So we've included those in the slides just as a reminder. Kieran, you have a question?
Yes. Unfortunately, it wasn't clearer for me what you meant. So if you can backtrack
Yeah.
and just talk us through a little bit more what the difference is when you're comparing a specialist area, which is about learning technology, and you're a specialist in this particular area of learning technology, and the advanced area where you kind of a leader in learning technology. But it's still not clear for me. It's quite
absolutely
murky.
So when you're doing I think the biggest difference with the specialist area and the advanced areas, the specialist area could be quite a common area that multiple people do, when you're looking at how you're providing something distinctive in that specialist area. So it could be something like creation of learning assets. Lots of people do creation of learning assets. It's your specialist area because you've invested a little bit more time, a little more development in that particular part of your role. Advanced areas, if you want to take that specialist area, make it an advanced area, you've really got to look at how course asset development has you've either developed models or you've influenced others in their area of course asset development, and really start to think about maybe different frameworks that you've brought in and how that's impacted a much bigger area. That would be my trying to sort of differentiate how you sort of something that's a bit more business as usual versus something that you've really invested in terms of an area of practice. I'm going to invite Julie and Pooy in as well to make sure I'm not digging myself a hole here.
No, I agree with that. I mean, it is very different to specialists, but it's always a little unclear from the guidelines what actually is the difference. But I posted in the chat what the guidelines actually say. So as you said, Matt, the specialist is like you've got a particular area of focus that's your specialism. The advanced area is more about that leadership and impact, how you work with others, how you influence, how you make decisions. We would recommend just focus on leadership as your advanced area. Don't try to do another area like, oh, I'm going to do learning design, because actually that could end up just being more of a specialist area. So when I did mine, I focused purely on leadership. And actually what I did was I cross-referenced across my portfolio. So I started off with what leadership means to me. I talked about some of the leadership development I'd done. I talked about my own leadership values. And, I then used the portfolio. I basically reflected across the portfolio, and I used the headings, which are the 4 core principles. And under each heading, I wrote a reflection. Now, there were some areas where I brought in a bit more evidence because maybe some of the examples I talked about in the portfolio, I wanted to add a bit more to, but I cross-reference back. So when I talk about commitment to exploring and understanding the interplay between technology and learning, I'm looking at my section here. I referenced section 1A, where I talked about producing business continuity guidance. I talked about 1C, which was where I'd pulled together this online learning task force, and thinking about, the different aspects of your portfolio across. So where have you demonstrated that leadership? But reflecting broadly. So I think it says in the guidelines, this is more of a holistic approach rather than a drill down into a particular specialism. And I think, as Matt said, it's about showing that sustained practice over a period of time and how you've developed as an individual. How is your practice developed? So, we would recommend focus on leadership as your advanced area, and then tie it in with the rest of your portfolio.
Yeah, I agree with Julie. So in my specialist, one of my specialist areas is sharing knowledge in online spaces and various communities of practice. So I talked about my contribution in those sort of communities and my involvement, etc., etc. And then in my advanced area is I talked about how I identify gaps in those communities of practice and how I then decided to build other communities off of the top of that. So they are pretty much related, but I think a specialist area is something that you can consider as something you've contributed to, but the advanced area really is something, what is so special about your practice that's different to other people? How have you led to clear improvement and development in whatever the area is? So in my advanced area, I talked about, I developed a researcher community, particularly in digital education, and how that has influenced other people to take up more research in digital education. So it is very much about leadership. You don't have to be special, but we're looking at what's unique about your advanced area that maybe without you, that whatever that is might not be as impactful or might not exist. I think that's what we're looking for.
Does that help, Kiran?
Yes, it does. I have another question, which is kind of a follow-up question. I'm thinking, is it best to kind of rewrite the portfolio, or is it better to kind of add a senior kind of section to your portfolio? I don't know how you transition from the CMALT to the senior CMALT.
It's a
If
very
you're
good
kind of
question.
doing broadly,
Yeah.
not the exactly same roles keep changing, and you're going to show how it's more senior. But let's say you've talked about just use a particular technology. When you're writing it from the CMALT perspective, you're trying to kind of hit the knowledge gap on a different level. But now I could talk about the same technology from a leadership point
That's
of
right.
view.
And that is the.
But would that work or not work? Is the question.
Well, when I was doing mine, I rewrote it. It was far easier to rewrite it from that different lens to make sure that I was having leadership and impact throughout the whole portfolio. And when reflecting as well, is as on this slide, it's really important to reflect on your practice, not on what's happening in the sector. We don't want to look at portfolios that are commentaries on the sector in a specialist area or whatever, or particular technology. It's your practice. Now, if you're looking at if you're trying to reflect on your practice at a senior CMALT level, you have to reflect there on the leadership and the impact aspects of it, which you may not have done in your standard CMALT. So I rewrote it. I don't know what other colleagues here have done. There may be ways of doing it where you don't have to rewrite the whole thing. Evidence, for example, can be used to back up both the standard and senior CMALT. So I think it's probably more in the reflective area that you're probably looking at rewriting.
I agree. I think reflection is different when you're looking at reflecting on my, like we were saying earlier, the difference between a CMALT and a senior CMALT is a CMALT is about you. So when you're reflecting, naturally you're reflecting how have whatever I done benefited me as a person in my practice, whereas senior CMALT is a lot more about your influence on other people. So naturally the reflection should be different. I think I will wrote half of mine, and again, I'm not ashamed to admit that most of the areas that were referred were the copy and paste areas. So please don't do what I did. Just if you can afford the time, just rewrite the whole thing. It's easier. That said, if you are using the same examples, maybe the description, you could just edit those because those are more kind of factual. So I think with factual things, you could probably get away with not rewriting the whole thing, because if I've designed 2 MAs in the last 2 years, that is a fact. You can't change that. But I think impact and reflection, definitely, I would, if I had to do it again from scratch today, I'd definitely write the whole thing from scratch.
It doesn't have to be long as well. Portfolios do not have to be 30,000 words. A portfolio that is around 5,000 is probably where you want to be hitting.
Mine was only 29,500 words. What are you
at the most. Anyway, we're going to give some time now, actually, to give yourself a chance just to jot something out. and you put it, we welcome you to put it in the chat for the next 5 minutes. Just give yourself a bit of time just to take stock on what you've got as an example of demonstrating leadership, and then to think through how you'd evidence that impact as well, and any impact as well. And that's the final activity for today. We will wrap up just before 2 o'clock as well. So any further questions, please feel free to ask them now, put them in the chat or open your mic. But for the rest of the session, we would encourage you to just give yourself a little bit of time to just think about an example. And then if you want to pop it in the text chat, we can just give a little bit of feedback as well, if you like. I'll try and copy this into the chat as well. Andrew, you're asking about reassessment. You can move to, well, if you're applying for senior CMALT, I think it's a different price as well, isn't it?
It needs to be a complete submission. You can't.
Yeah.
You can top up, but it's topping up is still a complete portfolio. It's not the same as the 3-yearly.
It's not. Yeah.
Because that's very light touch, isn't it? If you just resubmitting for the same pathway.
Yeah,
I think you just let them know, don't you, that actually I've decided I'm going to upgrade to senior CMALT, and you would register as a senior CMALT candidate, and then they would just acknowledge that and not chase you for your 3-yearly review.
Yeah. Just trying to remember. I think I've done 3-yearly review on both my standard and my senior. But I don't think the timing quite matched, so I was never in that position. Ross, hello, Ross.
My question is about giving your evidence, but when it's confidential. So if I've got clients that I can't share information about, how do you go about that? Because it could be a bit tricky.
So the place I used to work at had a lot of confidentiality clauses on it. So the way that I did this was, first of all, the submission is confidential between you and the assessors. If your company or organization are happy with that, then that helps somewhat. But if they're not, then you would just need to redact. So you obviously need to be able to put in some evidence, but you might need to black out the names of individuals or the names of the organizations you're working with. Some of it might be commercially sensitive, so like the performance of a particular course or something, and then you'll have to make a judgment call there. Okay, well, if I'm going to use that as a piece of evidence, what could I share that isn't going to be commercially sensitive, if you're not allowed to share it? But it is supposed to be a confidential arrangement anyway, so there is that security there in terms of only the assessors will have access to the link that you provide to your portfolio, and obviously the alt team, but it's not going to go any wider than that. It's up to you then if you want to then create a public version of your portfolio. So I think if you looked at mine, I redacted some of the evidence from my public portfolio, but it was obviously part of my submission.
Okay, no, that's useful. I think once I get to it, I'll need to think about which bits might be redacted or withheld, or could just put confidential or something like that.
Yeah, and obviously it is possible to submit with passwords. So if you need that extra layer of security, you pass the password on to alt, who gives it to the assessor. So if it's a link that might be like a Google Doc or something that anyone could access, you can still add a password layer onto that if you needed to as well. That sometimes helps with some organizations and getting their buy-in to share for accreditation. Any other questions? Is there anything in the chat? Sorry, Julie or Puyin, I think I can see you've been responding to questions on the chat.
I think Sam had mentioned working at the Defence Academy and having to redact quite a lot. So yeah, I think, sometimes policies are behind, password protection. So you need to ask permission potentially to be able to include them in your portfolio.
Yeah.
I think, Angela, you're talking about an example about, advocating for not moving to a paid AI detector. So yeah, I mean, that's great example.
Yeah.
And I suspect most portfolios now are having AI as one of their specialist areas.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking part today. I'm just going to see if I failed to add the slide I was going to add from Alt. So just bear with me a second while I load it up, because it's a really important slide that you need to have. So it's the crucial discount code. And I said to Fiona, no, I'll add it on. And then this is where I realize I haven't. So let's just load it up here. QR code slide. Here we go, folks. And there we go. That's the one you need. So if you are looking to move to Senior CMALT, 20% discount on CMALT registration is available there. So take a screenshot, use your phone, however you engage with QR codes. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that's been useful to you. Thank you for your comments and questions and engagement today. And I know there's a whole range of other CMALT related activities this week. I know, Julie, you've been doing some drop-ins recently as well. And it's a good opportunity if there's more of those available for the rest of this week for getting that one-to-one input as well from an assessor. And hopefully, I look forward to seeing many of your portfolios coming through in the near future.